Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mafia and Gangsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do one last entry here. This one just based on a random page, one that I found in the website I love using, thefullwiki.org, specifically the Mafia section there. And this particular just random entry happens to be probably the most interesting one yet that I've come across, only because finally we have an entry involving someone that was pretty much knee deep in a real world company. So here you have someone who has ties to the mafia, but at the same time was operating as a double life in a real company. In this case, the New York Post. You've heard of that newspaper before? So have I. Very, very popular newspaper throughout the US and in some cases throughout the world itself. And you have someone embedded so far deep in there that not only were they able to have many members of the mafia crew working within the newspaper itself, but they also were able to tie in a lot of the employees with their mafia activities. It was crazy, and I was reading this information because every time I've read stuff like this in the past, it usually has to do with like construction or other stuff that the mafia members are most known to go into. But no, in this case, it has to do with the newspaper world, and it has to do with this gentleman. You're looking at him specifically. His name was Robert Francis Perino, but he was known primarily as Bobby Perino. Interestingly enough, he did not have anything as far as, let's say, a nickname like most of the other mafia members have. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with this mafioso member of the newspaper New York Post. So who was this guy, this Robert Perino? Well, he was actually someone, if you could believe this, who was in law enforcement throughout a 20-year career. He was a cop, an NYPD cop there in Little Italy, Manhattan. He did his 20 years and then he basically just retired thereafter. That's a popular thing there in the NYPD world. I've read that multiple times in the past. Once you finish your 20 years, then that's it. They hit the 20-year mark with 1 day at most beyond that, and then that's it. They're retired and they move on into another career. Of course, in those situations, most of them do something else, nothing like what this guy did, this Robert Perino. He ended up actually just going into the world of organized crime. How do you go from being a cop for 20 years to then being in the world of the mafia? To this day, people don't know why exactly he did this. It's not like he had any direct, in this case, family members that were involved in the mafia world. The closest he had a relationship with was his father-in-law, a guy by the name of Nicholas Marangello, but that's it. Like, it's not like he had like fathers or sons or anything else in that world. So, but there he was. He ended up working for the Bonanno crime family, and he elevated himself within it. And then he was actually then placed into an employment there at the New York Post. And it was surprising to read that it's not like he was the first one there from the mafia world itself. No, in this case, they have had members there for decades before. He was just simply replacing someone else that was going out of that situation. And then he was able to become a top person, career person, like an elevated office manager person there within the New York Post. In fact, I think his title was Superintendent of Deliveries. That was essentially his title there. It still just blows my mind, the idea that the New York Post, one of the most esteemed newspapers out there, even if they do have, like in this case, they're famous for their shocking titles, the front cover stuff that's meant to be eye-grabbing type stuff. In this case, though, he was able to be employed within them. He lived just 3 blocks away from them, and with his influence, he was able to immediately start creating some money for the mafia. And this is the way they would do it. Apparently, because he was the superintendent of deliveries, he was able to in turn basically organize the theft of thousands of these copies of the daily newspaper there at the New York Post. He would somehow have them go missing, or somehow, I'm sorry, not have them go missing but without being noticed. And then he would basically have members of the mafia sell these copies at a fraction of the price to independent street vendors and stores scattered throughout Manhattan and Staten Island. The idea was this: normally those places would have to pay 50 cents for each copy if they bought it during a legitimate avenue, and then they would in turn of course sell it for a slight profit on their end, like the standard retail price. But no, in this case they bought them for, I think it was 20 to 30 cents instead of paying 50 cents, and then they still sold it at the retail price. So clearly they were in on it because those street vendors and stores loved being able to make more money. And then in the case of the Bonanno crime family, they loved it because every single day, imagine that, tens of thousands of these papers were being sold on a daily basis. That's a very good amount of cash flow that they were able to do, and this was all again under his watch, under this guy Robert Perrino, because of his superintendent of deliveries status. Not only that, but I was mentioning earlier that he was able to entrench so many of the mafia members there. No less than 50 mafia members of the Bonanno crime family ended up having employee statuses there at the New York Post, but they were part of the infamous no-show jobs. If you ever heard those in the mafia world, it has to do with this. Those are those jobs that are set up essentially just to collect a yearly pay, but these are employees that will never show up. It's usually in the world of unions and the world of mafia that this stuff is very rampant. And so when that happened, you had 50 employees, each of them collecting up to $50,000 a year for just being basically on the payroll. Isn't that crazy? And then he was also able to place actual mafia members in certain distribution plants. I was able to read at least 3 of them, and no doubt they were there to help influence and to help distribute all these stolen thousands and thousands of newspapers each day. And then the employees, the rest of the employees there at the New York Post, I don't know what their employee count was, but it must have been a lot, because they were able, under his influence, Rob Perino, he was able to have those employees given things and sold things such as firearms, ammunitions, drugs, and in other case loan shark debts to those employees, because to the mafia it was essentially a whole other world of employees to barter their business with, to work with, in other words, in the mafia world. So he was able to do so, and anybody who in this case failed to essentially pay back any money owed, he was known to actually take out these nunchuck sticks, like the ones you've seen in Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, those chukka sticks. He was able to use those as a way to threaten these employees to start paying. Well, after a certain time period, it seems like this lucrative world eventually had to come to an end, because the FBI and the Attorney General and then other people within certain law enforcement, they started to notice, of course, what was happening in the New York Post, and so they started to gather evidence. And the easiest way to do so was they took a recording device and basically planted it within Perino's office, and it was probably like the straightest path to be able to gather this evidence, because this guy Rob Perino, he could not be like a no-show employee. He actually would have to do business transactions and everything he normally does in his office, because again, he was the superintendent of delivery. So this was his actual, in a weird way, career. He was just working for the mafia at the same time. So having that microphone planted in there, they were able to gather all the evidence they needed. During his day-to-day activities, he was able to then talk into the wire transmitter about the illegal stuff that they were doing. Like, he was talking about the distribution of the newspapers. He was naming very specific mafia members from the Bonanno crime family there as well. He was also discussing his own role there too. He just basically gave them all the evidence that was needed, and so that's when the law enforcement team, they eventually went in and then arrested a lot of people. But interestingly enough, it turns out that out of all those people that were involved within the New York Post, only a small handful of them ever truly had anything bad happen to them. A lot of them actually ended up going back to the New York Post and getting elevated positions thereafter. Keep in mind, this was after being found in this case, handling so many of the bad things that the mafia was doing there in the New York Post, but they were able to go back in there and then basically have nothing bad happen to them, such as the power in this case of the Union World. By the way, if you're wondering, like, if the mafia ever tried to influence any stories, let's say within the New York Post, maybe stuff that was going to be reported on them and then in a bad way and then try to change it. No, apparently they didn't care about that kind of stuff. All they really cared about was the distribution of the newspapers and the easy money that was able to come from it. Now, if you're wondering whatever happened to this guy Robert Perino, well, once the jig was up as far as this investigation and the infiltration of the New York Post and the arrests that happened thereafter, eventually the Bonanno crime family thought to themselves, well, all the information that he gave, even if it wasn't purposefully, they still thought that there's a chance that he could actually turn into a government witness, because so much stuff was going to be handed to him, like all these charges, all this potential jail time. And so they basically summoned him. And the way the story goes was, for the longest time, he basically disappeared. Like, he went one day, according to his daughter, he went one day out of his home, telling his daughter that he was just going to go somewhere for an appointment in Brooklyn, herself not knowing, of course, that he was being summoned. And when he went out there, he was never seen again, and eventually he was just declared legally dead. And I think this happened like in the late 80s or so, whenever this occurred, and eventually, like, he was just basically just declared dead thereafter. His disappearance, after a good while, nobody was able to find any evidence of his existence, and so by that point he was just, in 1997, legally declared dead. It was only afterward that the true evidence came out, and ironically it came from a mafia member turned government witness. He was able to describe, and this was also mentioned in another book that I was reading the information on. Basically it went like this: once he was summoned, he was taken to a home, and then once there, as soon as he walked in, almost basically like straight out of the Goodfellas movie, he was shot several times point blank in the back of the head, and then surprisingly he still survived, and so he was taken care of afterward with, in this case, a knife to the heart and then multiple stabs thereafter. Then he was taken someplace and buried within, underneath the concrete of what was soon to be a built building. But afterward, and this is where it gets a little weird, his body started to rise from the ground. Maybe the shifting of the ground itself, all the construction surrounding it. Either way, though, the concrete started to push up, and then that's when they realized, you know what, let's go ahead and let's take him out and bury him someplace else. But then, to their surprise, one of those people that ended up doing that work, in that case of killing him or burying him elsewhere, they're the ones that ended up turning, in this case, another government witness. And when that happened, they took his body and they buried it yet someplace else as well. So very interesting stuff with regards to that. His body apparently has never been found, if I'm not mistaken. Like, it was found once in terms of his skeleton being located by one of the turncoats, but afterward, once that happened, he was basically taken someplace else and buried thereafter. That's why for the longest time he was essentially legally declared dead, even though there was no evidence of his body. But there he was, Robert Perino in this case. You had a guy who was a cop for 20 years, for whatever reason decided to then become somebody in the world of the mafia, became entrenched in the New York Post, had a pretty lucrative career there. I mean, I was reading information about him owning a very large home in a secluded area, someplace where obviously like somebody under even a New York Post salary shouldn't have that type of luxury. And then afterward, having that world, thinking that everything was just going to be basically the best thing ever, all of that eventually just caught up to him when he knew too much info, and then the mafia took care of him thereafter. If anybody has any more info, anything else that you'd like to share, please post those comments below. But isn't this interesting? The very first time I'm running into in this case a story, a guy that I'm chronicling for these videos, dealing with someone that was fully entrenched within a legitimate company, somebody that was absolutely here, in this case in the New York Post, a world-renowned name when it comes to the newspaper print, and yet there he was doing all-day activity for the mafia world. So alright everybody, thanks again as always, take care.